Hi, I'm Marin, and this is the story of how I was left in the woods at 13, and how someone I never expected helped me survive, not just the night, but the years that followed. My mother didn't scream, didn't cry. She just opened the car door and told me to get out. And when she drove away, I thought that would be the last chapter of my life anyone would ever read. But sometimes, kindness shows up in silence. And sometimes, being forgotten is exactly how you begin to remember yourself. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. It wasn't the cold that made me shiver that day. It was the silence in the car. Mom didn't even hum along to the radio this time. We drove east out of Kalispell under a sky the color of old newspapers. Pine trees stood like guards on either side of the road, tall and rigid, their tips shaking in the wind. My mom's hands clutched the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She hadn't looked at me since I got in the car. Even at 13, I had learned that quiet meant something was coming. And in our house, surprises weren't good. I sat still in the passenger seat, my backpack nestled between my feet, one strap coiled loosely around my ankle. It was more of a habit than comfort. I stared straight ahead, but my eyes kept darting toward her, watching the tension build in her jaw, her shoulders tight beneath her ivory sweater. She looked like one of the women in the catalogs she kept stacked by her bed. Flawless, unmoved, unreachable. We passed a gas station where a man in a flannel shirt leaned against the pump, sipping from a styrofoam cup. He didn't look our way. No one ever really did. That was the last sign of anything human. After that, the radio let out a long sigh of static and went silent. My phone, nestled in my coat pocket, lost its bars. The world narrowed. The road thinned. When she suddenly veered off onto a gravel path, my heart jolted into my throat. Dust curled behind the car, like a question no one wanted answered. I looked over, hoping she'd explain. She didn't. The trees closed in. The light dimmed. Then we stopped. She threw the gear into park and opened her door, her heels crunching on the gravel. Before I could move, she was at my side, opening my door. Her perfume, cinnamon and vanilla, hit me in a wave, too warm for the air. "Out," she said. I blinked at her. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer, just reached across me, unclicked the seatbelt, and tugged the strap away from my chest like it had offended her. "Out!" I slid sideways and planted my good foot on the ground. The other followed, slower, careful. My brace shifted, not quite right, and as I stood, my knee buckled. I hit the dirt with a thud, sharp and sudden. The wind bit through my jacket. Gravel pressed into my palms. My backpack thudded beside me. Then came the duffel bag, my old one. A patch with a turtle still clung to the side. Delia looked down at me, arms crossed. "When you're ready to stop making everything about you, you can come back." My voice caught in my throat. "You can't just leave me here." She said nothing, just turned, walked back to the car, and closed the door behind her. The brake lights flared once, painting the trees red. Then the car reversed, turned, and disappeared. And I was alone. The wind howled softly, stirring the pine needles at my feet. I sat still for a minute, too stunned to cry. My fingers curled into the dirt. I pulled the duffel toward me with trembling hands. Inside, a sweater, a nearly empty water bottle, a notebook with bent pages, a granola bar. No flashlight, no phone charger, no map. My ankle throbbed from the fall. I flexed my knee, wincing as the brace pulled at the skin. The clearing wasn't much. A patch of bare ground, moss at the edges, the smell of cold, and something like sap hanging in the air. Beyond it, the forest stretched in every direction. Too dense, too quiet. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. An old wooden deer stand, about 20 yards away. The platform above looked warped, maybe rotting. The ladder was crooked. But it was something. Dragging the duffel behind me, I began to crawl. The soil was soft in places, brittle in others. A fog had started to rise, clinging to the underbrush like breath. I pushed through ferns, dry leaves crunching under my palms. The cold was setting in, not sharp yet, but creeping. Each pull forward made my ankle scream, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the base of the stand and leaned against the post, breath ragged. My hands were scraped, my elbows stiff. I pulled my coat tighter and tucked the duffel against my side. Somewhere behind me, a branch cracked. As she crawls toward an old wooden deer stand, her hand lands on a pine cone, and something feels watched. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember the snap of a twig, and suddenly I wasn't alone. My eyes flew open. The cold had stiffened everything, my back, my fingers, even the air in my lungs. It took a second to remember where I was. Under the deer stand, wrapped in a too-thin coat, duffel bag crumpled under my side. The clearing around me glowed faintly with the pale hush of a cloudy sky. No moon, no stars. Just a forest too quiet for comfort. There it was again. A sound, closer this time. Not the rustle of leaves. Heavier, slower. I held my breath, and then I saw them. Boots. Not new, not clean. Old leather, dark and crusted with mud. The kind of boots that had walked more than roads. They stopped just a few feet from where I lay. I didn't move. My fingers gripped a pine cone as if that would help. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound beyond what the woods allowed. He crouched slowly, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded jacket that blended into the trees. His face stayed shadowed. One hand reached behind him and returned with a water bottle. He held it out to me without a word. I hesitated, but thirst burned worse than fear. I took it with shaky hands. Then came a granola bar. Slightly torn wrapper. No label. He placed it on my lap and turned his attention to the fire pit. I hadn't noticed it yet. Just a rough circle of stones with a few twigs, already arranged like someone had done it before. He struck flint. Once. Twice. Sparks danced in the dark. Mom used to say no one would care for a broken girl, but someone had left footprints near my fire. The man didn't speak, not once. He just coaxed a small flame to life, then layered sticks slowly, methodically. Smoke rose in thin ribbons. The warmth spread in cautious circles. Then he stood, removed the thick flannel coat from his shoulders, and draped it over mine like it had always belonged there. Still no eye contact, still no questions. He backed away a few steps, turned, and vanished into the trees. I waited. 10 seconds, a minute, maybe more. Nothing but the wind and the pop of the fire. I curled into the coat, pressing my face into the collar. It smelled like cedar and campfire, and something old. Not bad, just real. The last person to wrap something warm around me had done it while complaining about dry cleaning bills. I clutched the coat tighter. Then I thought about hugs, about the last one I remembered. It was from Mrs. Norwell, my 5th grade teacher, after my science fair project got stepped on. She had said, "That wasn't fair, sweetie," and I had believed her. A sound rustled nearby, but this time I wasn't afraid. Eventually, I reached into the duffel again, looking for the granola bar. My fingers brushed paper instead. I pulled it out, creased at the edges, folded in half. My breath caught. I knew that paper. I'd drawn on it years ago. A willow tree beside a lake, done in pencil and smudged at the corners. I thought I'd lost it in the move from my old school. Someone had kept it. I stared at the lines, my own handwriting scrawled at the bottom. Be softer than they expect. It had been my secret, one of those things you write when you still believe people change. I didn't know what it meant that it had found its way back to me. But I held it close, slid it between the pages of my notebook, and zipped it in. The fire cracked gently, lighting the underside of the deer stand above me. I leaned back against the trunk and let the warmth hit my cheeks. Somewhere inside, a little part of me, small and still sore, began to unfurl. Not trust, not safety, just pause. I whispered, "Thank you," to the darkness, not sure if I meant it for the man or for simply not dying. Before dawn, she hears one more noise. This time, a low human cough not far from the tree line. 20 years later, I didn't think I'd ever see her again. But there she was, Delia, in a cafe window, sipping tea like nothing happened. It was early November, the kind of morning where the chill sat just beneath your skin, sharp but not painful. I had just dropped off a custom bookshelf at Wren's Books and Bindery, 2 blocks from the shop, and decided to walk the long way back. The leaves along Higgins Avenue were more amber than gold now, curling at the edges, scattered in lazy piles along the sidewalk. I was halfway past the cafe when something inside me tugged. I turned my head. There. In the second booth from the window, framed by warm string lights and the steam of a tea kettle, sat the woman who'd left me in the woods with a bag of granola bars and no goodbye. Delia. Her hair was shorter now. The dark dye faded to something silvery near the temples. Her lipstick was still precise, and the scarf around her neck looked like something from a winter catalog, expensive, intentional. She laughed at something the man across from her said, fingers poised elegantly around a china teacup. Her nails were done in that muted mauve she always claimed went with everything. She didn't look out the window. I backed up so quickly, I nearly tripped on the curb. My chest tightened, heat rising beneath my coat like the start of a fever. I ducked into the vintage store next door, the bell over the door jingling in a way that felt too loud. Inside, it smelled of mothballs and cedar. I gripped the edge of the first shelf I found, blinking hard. My fingers closed around a picture frame, oak, hand-carved, the same beveled edge pattern my dad once made before he disappeared from our family photos. The frame was empty, just a sheet of glass and a price tag. Somehow that made it worse. The last time I saw her, I was crawling across frozen dirt, praying she'd come back. I let the frame go. The walk back to the shop was a blur. I barely noticed the wind or the stoplight I didn't wait for. When I pushed open the back door, the familiar scent of sawdust and lemon oil grounded me. Earl was sanding a cabinet face, humming something old and bluegrassy. He glanced up. "You all right?" I nodded too fast. "Yeah, just saw someone I wasn't expecting." He didn't press. He never did. That was one of the reasons I'd stayed. I finished the day in silence, hands busy with smoothing planes and wood glue. The ache in my knee had started around lunchtime, but I worked through it, like always. When the sun began to set, I locked up and walked home the long way, through alleys and side streets where faces were fewer and shadows didn't ask questions. At home, I boiled pasta I didn't eat and left the kitchen light on for no reason. Around 9, I pulled the coat from the back of my closet, the same flannel I'd kept all these years. I didn't wear it often, but I never quite let it go. The fabric was thinner now, the colors faded, but the weight of it still settled around my shoulders like memory. I ran my fingers along the inside seam, just out of habit. That's when I felt it. A bump, small, stiff, tucked between the layers. I turned the sleeve inside out, squinting in the dim light. There, faint but unmistakable, someone had written a name in small looping script. S. Hartwell. I stared at it, lips parted, breath caught between past and present. Hartwell. I didn't know anyone by that name, but the handwriting wasn't mine, and Delia had never sewn a thing in her life. I traced the letters with the tip of my finger. A clue? A signature? A message? I didn't sleep much. The next morning, as I stood barefoot in the kitchen, nursing a half-cold cup of coffee, my phone buzzed. Voicemail. I played it without thinking. Hi, this is Saint, Luke's hospital. We have Delia Holloway here, asking for you. My chest tightened when I saw her. It had been 20 years since I last saw that face and figure, the person who had abandoned me. The feelings of 20 years ago suddenly came back to me at this moment. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comments section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. The name stitched in the coat hem hadn't meant anything to me for 20 years, until I saw it again, carved into the back of a church bench. I stood in the doorway of First Light Community Church, the scent of old wood and brewed coffee settling around me like a memory I hadn't planned to revisit. It had been decades since I'd last been here. The walls hadn't changed, still painted a soft cream, the bulletin board still crowded with fading flyers and casserole sign-up sheets. The morning air followed me in, crisp and biting, swirling around my ankles. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe warmth. Maybe proof that the name in my coat wasn't just a figment from a half-forgotten nightmare. The sanctuary was empty except for a few hymnals left scattered across pews. My steps echoed softly as I walked down the center aisle, eyes scanning every wooden bench. Near the third row from the back, I stopped. There, carved faintly into the underside of the pew, where a hand might rest during prayer or fear, were 2 letters. S.H. I ran my fingers over the grooves. Shallow, careful. Someone had done this quietly, secretly. South Hartwell. The flannel coat. The way the man never spoke just helped. That name felt like a breadcrumb someone had left behind. A throat cleared behind me. I remember you, came a voice, gentle and warm. I turned. Reverend Amos stood by the side entrance, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, his free hand tucked into a cardigan pocket. His beard had thinned, more white than gray now, but his eyes were the same. Kind, curious, unafraid of silence. I used to come here sometimes, I said. A long time ago. He nodded. You always sat near the back, usually when it rained. I smiled faintly. I was cold, and it was quiet. He walked slowly toward me and settled into the pew behind mine. Not many people carve into these benches, but that one, he gestured to the initials. I've seen it before. Belonged to a boy. Name was Silas Hartwell. Quiet type. Came alone, left alone. I swallowed. What happened to him? Reverend Amos shook his head. Vanished after high school. Nice kid. Odd but kind. Always left an extra quarter in the donation box, even when he looked like he hadn't eaten. I didn't say anything. My hand rested on the bench, as though it might still be warm. Later, back at the shop, I spent most of the afternoon sanding edges I didn't need to sand. Earl watched me from the corner of the room, leaning against a cabinet door he hadn't hung yet. You good? He asked eventually, voice low, like he wasn't sure he should ask. I'm fine, I said too quickly. He hesitated. I think Silas might be in town again. Heard it from someone at the feed store. My stomach tightened. I didn't answer. Earl nodded slowly. Just thought you'd want to know? I didn't know what I wanted. After dark, I ignored the second call from the hospital. They left a voicemail. Delia was asking for me again. Her condition had shifted. But I didn't listen past the first few words. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. The porch light flickered when I stepped outside to bring in the mail. That's when I saw it. A small cedar box. No name. Just a simple string tied around it. I carried it inside like it might break. The lid creaked when I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of soft cloth, was my sketchbook. The one I'd lost the night I left. Pages curled at the corners, the spine frayed. Tucked inside the front cover was a note, written in ink that had slightly bled through the paper. You were seen, S. I stared at it for a long time. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, quieter, something like recognition. The next morning, I returned to the church. The sanctuary was empty again, sunlight spilling through stained glass in soft yellows and blues. I walked to the back pew, the one with the carved initials, and sat down slowly. The wood creaked as I leaned forward. Why now? I whispered, just as someone stepped into the back pew. She looked older, but her voice, Delia's voice, still held that tight control like a string pulled too hard. The room was quieter than I expected. No television, no flowers crowding the windowsill, just the steady rhythm of a heart monitor and the soft hiss of air through a vent that needed cleaning. She lay with her back half raised by a mechanical bed, blanket folded neatly across her lap like a dinner napkin. Her hair, once dyed religiously every third Thursday, had grown out in streaks of white, but her expression was the same, tight, unreadable, and angled just enough to imply disapproval. I didn't speak right away. I just sat at the foot of the bed, the hard vinyl chair creaking beneath me. A plastic pitcher of water sweated on the tray table, untouched. Her hands were thinner than I remembered, but still folded just so, like she expected someone to walk in and judge her for looking unkempt. She turned her head slightly, not enough to meet my eyes. So dramatic, even now, she said. The words landed like dust, not sharp, not loud, just familiar. You're dramatic, Moran. That's what she used to say every time I cried, even when I came home limping. Even when the nurse called to say I was faint and feverish, it was always easier to doubt me than to look in the mirror. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. From it, I slid a printed photograph and placed it gently on the nightstand. No explanation, no flourish. One image was of a church bench, initials faintly carved into the wood, S.H. The other was a copy of my old drawing, The Willow by the Water, signed in pencil with the quote I wrote as a kid. Be softer than they expect. Delia glanced at them briefly, before brushing the photo aside with the back of her hand. It slid across the table like a piece of junk mail. It never happened like that, she said flatly. You always twist things. I stood slowly, smoothing the hem of my coat. You erased me, I said, not angry, just tired. But someone else remembered. The monitor kept its pace. Beep, beep, beep. She didn't reply. She looked at the wall instead, eyes narrowed as if there was something better to stare at than me. I turned to leave. In the hallway, the scent shifted. Less antiseptic, more detergent and weak coffee. I found a bench outside the nurse's station and sat down. My legs ached, not from walking, but from holding too much stillness. A nurse I hadn't seen before approached, her badge clipped sideways, her hair pinned back in a swirl of gray. "Lydia," it read. She didn't say anything, just handed me a small paper cup of coffee and sat beside me without fanfare. I didn't drink it, but I held it anyway. Inside the room, Delia's voice had gone silent again. The past had a way of screaming in silence. As I reached the parking lot, the clouds broke briefly, just enough to let a sliver of light catch on the hood of my car. I paused before unlocking the door, letting the cold air settle into my lungs. Then I heard it. "Suppose you think you're better now," she called from the window. Her voice was thinner than it used to be, not weaker, just worn. I turned only once. "No," I said, "just not broken." Back home, I kicked off my boots and set the coat on the chair by the door. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the sink and the faint whir of the heater turning on. I stood there, coatless, unsure what to do next. The phone buzzed once. Voicemail. I played it on speaker while staring at the sketch still pinned to the fridge. Earl's voice came through, low and steady. "He left something for you. Come by before we close." The box Earl gave me was old cedar, smooth and light. I recognized it. It was mine. But I never built it. I ran my hand along the grain, fingertips catching on a shallow groove near the latch. The lid had a slight crack, hairline, like it had breathed too deeply once and never quite settled back into place. I lifted it slowly. Inside, cushioned by folded muslin, was a small clay sculpture. A curled fox, no bigger than my palm, with a chipped ear and half a tail. I made it when I was 13. In a community class, Delia called a waste of time. I remembered leaving it behind when we moved that fall. Rushed, unwanted, forgotten. And yet, here it was. Whole. Earl stood a few feet away in the shop, wiping his hands on a cloth he didn't really need. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching dust motes in the air. The smell of sawdust was thick, familiar, grounding. "He kept it," I said quietly. Earl nodded once, eyes soft. "Silas found it after the fire pit went cold. You'd already gone." My breath caught. I didn't know what to say. "I never asked," he continued, "but I think he knew even back then. You weren't supposed to be out there alone." I set the sculpture down gently, like it could still bruise. "He's your son," I said, not quite a question. Earl nodded again, slower this time. Wasn't always easy. He never said much, just noticed things, fixed what he could, left the rest alone. I stared at the fox. Someone had painted a thin gold line across the tailbrake, sealing it like a scar made holy. That afternoon, I packed up my display for the town's annual art fair. I hadn't planned on showing The Room They Forgot, a carved panel I'd been working on for months. But something about the fox shifted that. The fair filled the sidewalks near the Riverwalk. String lights hung from tents. Kids ran between stalls clutching apple cider in styrofoam cups. I set up my small booth between a woman who sold homemade jams and a high schooler crocheting animals with lopsided ears. My piece stood at the center of my table, a wooden relief of a narrow room, door half open, shadows pressed against the far wall. Beside it sat something new, finished just last night, a bird with one wing tucked tight, the other cracked and sealed with gold resin, my own version of kintsugi. I called it Becoming. People passed and paused, some nodding, others frowning thoughtfully. I didn't need their questions. The pieces said enough. Late in the afternoon, a girl with tangled brown hair and a corduroy jacket stopped at the table. She looked maybe 13, maybe younger. Her fingers hovered above the sculpture, but didn't touch. She glanced up at me. My mom says I'm too emotional. I didn't smile right away. I waited. I liked your bird, she added, barely above a whisper. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook. It had a flower pressed between the first 2 pages. Write it down, I said. She blinked, then nodded, taking the notebook like it might disappear. As the sun dipped behind the hill, turning the pavement orange, I caught movement across the square. A man stood by the coffee booth, hood up, hands in his pockets. He didn't come closer, but he looked straight at me. I knew that stillness. Silas didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just nodded once. I nodded back. No one else seemed to notice. I packed my table in silence, letting the last light catch on the golden crack of the bird's wing. The girl with the notebook was already gone. Somewhere, maybe, writing down something no one else had let her say. Not everything broken stays broken. Sometimes it becomes something else entirely. Sometimes the quietest acts are the ones that echo the longest. A carved initial, a box sealed in gold, a stranger who stayed silent but never looked away. These were the threads that stitched my story back together. We often assume that kindness needs to be loud, visible, or returned. But true compassion moves quietly, asking nothing in return, and yet offering everything. Kindness, like light through old church glass, finds its way in, even when we think we've shut every window. If this story has touched something within you, maybe today's the day to see someone a little more gently. You never know what small act might be remembered 20 years from now as the one that made all the difference.